I don't know if you've seen this particular movie or not, and allow me a brief digression outside of the Bible for a moment, just to say that this is a fantastic movie, by the way. It tells the story of some African American women who worked for NASA during the space program, and they were the original computers, because the word computer before the modern era meant a person who did computations. And so their job titles literally was computer. The story, obviously tells of the fact that these women, and the three were highlighted, but there were more, of course. These women did phenomenal work, mostly behind the scenes, largely uncredited until later. And yet they had a profound impact on the space program. It's based on a true story. It's based on a book written about the true story. Again, I highly recommend it. But my main purpose is I'm stealing the title, because our talk this morning is on the hidden figures of Matthew chapter 1. So when you think of the word genealogy, particularly in the Bible, what is it that's the first thing that comes to mind? If you're honest, it's begat, 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 begat. Right? That's the first thing that comes to mind. Oh, goody, just tell me he's not going to talk about the first 9 chapters of First Chronicles. Yes, no, I won't. Promise. So what are the hidden figures in the genealogy of Matthew chapter 1? Well, let's read through it briefly, and then let's talk about it. Well, this is the record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Phares and Zara by Tamar, Phares the father of Esrom, Esrom the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. So we have 3 of the hidden figures here already. 4th one shows up in the next verse. David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. I'm just going to name the names here for the sake of time. So you have Solomon, then Rehoboam, then Abijah, then Asa, Jehoshaphat, Joram, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, Manasseh, Ammon, Josiah, and Jeconiah, and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. And then finally, after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah, Shealtiel, Zerubbabel, Abiud, Eliakim, Azor, Zadok, Achim, Eliud, Eleazar, Mathan, Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, by whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. Now, just real briefly, I do want to mention, although we're going to talk about the 4 women, notice that there's 3 sections from Abraham to David, David to the exile, and then the exile to Jesus. And in that second chunk from David to the exile, what you have listed is every king of Judah. The entire line of the kings of Judah, from David all the way through to the exile, is listed there. Now, if you go back and you read through Kings and Chronicles, they weren't all good guys, right? One of them, Manasseh, according to tradition, sawed Isaiah in half. That's the way he killed him. Now, of course, he repented later, but But there were some less than savory characters in this genealogy, but yet this establishes Jesus' legal right to the throne because he descended from the line of the kings. Anyway, back to the main point here, that we see that we have Tamar, Rahab, and Ruth, and then the wife of Uriah. So, who are these ladies, and why did they get called out? We've got Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. The genealogy recording 42 generations. Why are 4 women highlighted? The other 30-something weren't. Not that they weren't important, but they didn't get called out, and there's a reason for it. When you're doing your personal devotions, which I hope everybody's doing, when you read through the Bible and you come across something that's a little different, take some time and look it up. Why is that there? Let the Holy Spirit's piquing of your curiosity cause you to dig into this. So we're going to talk about the 4 women, their stories briefly. We could easily do an entire sermon on each one and probably multiple sermons on each one. Don't have time for that, so I'm just going to cover the highlights and then see what conclusions we can draw. Why are these women in this genealogy? So the first one is Tamar, and her story is told in Genesis chapter 38. But in order to appreciate the story, we need a little bit of context. So go back a few chapters. We know that God called Abraham to be basically the first Hebrew, the first Jew. Abraham was promised a son. That took quite a while. Eventually, Isaac was born, and Isaac had 2 sons, Jacob and Esau, and God told their mother that Jacob would be the one that would be in the line, carry the line along, not Esau. So let's go to Genesis chapter 27. Again, just covering the highlights here. Genesis chapter 27, Jacob effectively steals Esau's blessing. Esau was the oldest, but Jacob was the favored one. So Jacob takes Esau's blessing through deception. Does this sound like a great way to start the line of the Messiah? Yeah, well, it's there. Esau doesn't take this well and consoles himself with the idea that once his father has died, he's going to murder Jacob. Jacob finds out about this. His mother says, "You need to leave town now." So then he goes to her brother up in Paddan Aram. And so he flees. That's chapter 28. In chapters 29 and 30, he marries Laban's 2 daughters, Leah and Rachel. Soap operas got nothing on the Bible, all right? You know, anybody who thinks the Bible is boring has clearly never read it. There is more sex and violence in the Bible than you will find on most, well, up until recent times, most TV. So he marries the 2 of them, and he has children through them and their maidservants. So he's effectively got 4 wives, and he ends up producing 11 children. Well, along the way, God blesses him, not because he's righteous, but because God has promised it. So God blesses him. And, you know, his uncle and his uncle's men are getting jealous and upset about this. And so he's got to leave town again. So in chapter 31, he's fleeing from Laban with all of his possessions. Then what happens? On the way home, Jacob wrestles with God. That's how he gets his name, Israel, one who struggles with God. And along the way, good thing, he reconciles with Esau. So that's a good thing. Then what happens? Oh, then they spend some time in a place called Shechem, and the prince of the town rapes their sister. And brothers number 2 and 3 don't take this well. And to make a long story short, they end up murdering every single male in town. This is not going well, folks. Okay? So then they have to leave again. Chapter 35, Rachel, Jacob's favored wife of the 4, Rachel dies while giving birth to Benjamin. So it's Jacob's youngest son, and Rachel dies giving birth to him. Now, in the next chapter, it's kind of a sidebar where we get the entire descendants of Esau for the record. Okay, fine. Then back to the main story, chapter 37. Now, Joseph, son number 11, has dreams, and dreams of being in power and being in charge, and his brothers really don't like it because he's dad's favorite up until Benjamin's born. And again, make a long story short, they manage to kidnap him. They first want to kill him. Then Judas says, "No, let's not do that. Let's make some money off of this guy." And so they sell him into slavery. And then they take his coat, which was a special coat, and they dip it in some blood and take it back to dad and say, "Hey, do you recognize this coat?" "Oh, it's my son. It's been torn up by a wild animal." The deception continues. All right, now, finally, chapter 38. So Judah was the 4th son of Leah, and he, at some point, decides to leave the family and go stay with the Canaanites. This was not a good move. God told Abraham, Isaac, Jacob that the local people did not honor him. And eventually, of course, God said they were going to be wiped out because of their wickedness. So Judah decides to stay with the Canaanites. He marries a Canaanite woman, and he has 3 sons. Their names were Onan, and Shelah. Well, Judah gets a wife for the oldest son, and her name was Tamar, the first of the hidden figures. Now, the Bible is very brief at this point. Was wicked, and God kills him. That's all we hear about that. We don't know what he did. We don't know how bad it was. We don't know what it was. All we know is that he was wicked, and God killed him. Well, being wicked shouldn't have been a great surprise. They were living among the pagan Canaanites. That shouldn't be terribly surprising. However, it's pretty clear from the context of the text that Judah didn't figure this out. It never occurred to him that his sons were incurring the penalty of their behavior. That doesn't occur to him, at least at first. So what happens next? Well, by tradition, the second son is supposed to take the dead son's wife in order to be able to raise up children for the dead son. That was tradition. So what does Onan do? Well, he takes her as a wife, but, and I'll just be as generic as I can about this, he uses her as a sex object and doesn't let her get pregnant. God doesn't take this kindly. He gets killed too. All right? So then what happens? Well, now you're in a situation where, okay, your oldest 2 sons are dead. by tradition, the third son should marry the wife and raise children, at least for the first son. Not sure about the second one. But again, by tradition, that's what's supposed to happen. So what does Judah do? Well, he said, Sheila's not old enough yet, which may have been true at the time he said it. But it's pretty clear from reading it that he didn't actually want his youngest son to marry Tamar. Why? Basically, it's pretty clear that Judah thought, this lady is cursed. Every guy she marries dies. Now, again, does he wake up to the fact that his sons were wicked? No, that never enters his mind. Oh, it's her fault. It's her fault. So he says, so he comes up with this charade, basic. Oh, come live in my household, and when the boy's old enough, then you can marry him. Basically, it's like, well, that's what the tradition required. So he had the appearance of doing the right thing, but he didn't really have his heart in it. So time passes. Eventually, Judah's wife dies. He grieves. He goes through the normal grieving period, and then it's time to go. Apparently, it's the time of year for him to go shear, the men to shear the sheep. So he grieves. When he's done, he goes up to the place away from their home, goes up to the place where the men are shearing the sheep. And then this happens. To this day in the Middle East, women in most Middle Eastern countries, women are to be accompanied by a male relative. In some places, that's law in some countries of the Middle East. Now, don't get me wrong, the Bible champions women's rights, and I'm not here to change that. But there's a reason why they want a male relative to accompany females. And it's for the female's protection. That's where it came from. A lone female is a target, basically. Now, anyway, so what happens? Tamar was told, look, your father-in-law is going to Timnah to shear his sheep. So what does she do? She removes her widow's clothes, covers herself with a veil, wraps herself, sits at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the way to Timnah. She managed to jump ahead of them. And she did this, why? Because she saw that she had not been given to Shelah, the youngest son, as a wife, even though he had now grown up. Now, what she's about to do is wrong. However, let's give her a little bit of credit or not credit, but just understanding the situation. She grew up in a pagan culture. It's pretty clear that Judah didn't model the worship of Yahweh any better. His first two sons were so wicked that God kills him. So you have this pagan woman growing up in a pagan culture, not being properly influenced by a guy who's supposed to be worshiping Yahweh. And so what does she do? She takes the situation into her own hands. Now, remember that in this day and in that day and age, your sons were your Social Security. They were your retirement plan. You would have a very poor life indeed if you didn't have some sons to take care of you. So she says, look, this guy ain't doing what he's supposed to be doing, so I'm putting matters into my own hands. So what happens next? When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute because she had covered her face. He turned aside to her along the road and said, come, please, I want to sleep with you. He did not realize it was his daughter-in-law. She asked, what will you give me so that you may sleep with me? He replied, I'll send you a young goat from the flock. He was on his way to the herd. She asked, will you give me a pledge until you send it? It's like, no, sorry. I'm not going to trust your IOU. You need to give me something valuable. What pledge should I give you? She replied, your seal, your cord, the staff that's in your hand. So he gave them to her, slept with her. She became pregnant. She left immediately, removed her veil, put on her widow's clothes. Now, this is an actual seal from the time period and the region. Obviously, it's not Judas' seal, but it's something that's similar. What you have is, and this could be stone or obviously some very hard material. And look how intricate it is, very detailed. And when you roll it over clay, it puts the impression onto the clay. It was basically their version of a credit card or your signature, something official. It was unique to you. You made it in such a way that when you put your impression, the seal gave an impression, it's not going to get mixed up with anybody else's stuff. And it's not just his seal, it was also his staff and his cord. Those things were all unique. When you saw them, you knew immediately, these belong to so-and-so, without any doubt whatsoever. All right, what happens next? Well, Judah goes up to the flock, has his buddy, the Canaanite, hey, go take a young goat back to this lady at the entrance to the town. The friend goes. I mean, this could possibly have happened on the same day, maybe, because he was on his way up to the sheep. Friend comes, goes to the place, no prostitutes there. So then what? He's like, well, so then he starts asking around the people. And the people, what do they all say? There's no temple prostitute here. There's never been a temple prostitute here. He goes back to Judah and says, look, not only is she not there, but the townsfolk are saying there is no prostitute at that location. And Judah's going, okay, I don't know what's going on, but it's fine. She can just keep the stuff. I'm not going to raise a ruckus about it because, of course, it'll make him look bad. So then what happens? Well, he goes home. 3 months later, she's starting to show. After 3 months, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law Tamar has turned to prostitution. As a result, she has become pregnant. Judah says, bring her out and let her be burned. Okay, let's get this straight. Let's see. We call it double standards is what we call it nowadays. It's okay for him to do what he wants, but no, bring her out, let her be burned. While they were bringing her out, she sent word to her father-in-law, very calmly, I am pregnant by the man to whom these belong. Then she said, identify the one to whom the seal, cord, and staff belong. Judah recognized them and said, she is more upright than I am, because I wouldn't give her to Shelah, my son. So Judah starts to get the clue. He starts to recognize his own sinful condition. He repents. We see that it's he never slept with her again. It was wrong to do it in the first place, of course. And so he made sure she was taken care of, she was cared for, but he repented. He didn't touch her again. Now, it came about at the time that Tamar, was giving birth, that behold, there were twins in the womb. Moreover, it took place that while she was giving birth, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and put a scarlet thread on the hand, saying this one came out first. But he drew it back, and behold, the brother came out. So she says, oh, what a breach you have made. And he was named Phares, which means break out. Afterward, his brother came out, had the scarlet thread, and he was named Zara. So, hidden figure number one, Tamar. Not righteous. Her actions were understandable given the situation she was in, with a pagan culture and no witness from Judah. And as we're going to see, though, God redeems this situation. So keep that thought in mind. God redeems what seems to be hopeless situations. All right, we're going to come back to all these after we summarize their story. So hidden figure number 2 is Rahab. Her story is told in Joshua chapter 2 and chapter 6. And what we remember from the beginning of Joshua, one of the most famous scenes in the entire Bible, of course, is the walls of Jericho coming down and the Israelites wiping out the inhabitants of Jericho, with the exception of one family. So let's go back. Joshua chapter 2. Joshua, son of Nun, sent 2 spies out from Shittim secretly and instructed them, find out what you can about the land, especially Jericho. So they stopped at a house of a prostitute named Rahab and spent the night there. Now, let's pause for a second. A lot of people have speculated about that particular portion of Scripture. I wouldn't dwell on that too much because we know that God divinely directed them to her house because she was the only one in the whole town that had faith in Yahweh, that wanted to convert. Prostitutes are pretty good at keeping secrets. These guys were spies. Going there wasn't, completely out of the question, and highly unlikely they were going there to secure services. So don't let that trouble you too much. But unfortunately, somehow they were discovered, because what we see next is the king of Jericho receives this report. Note well, Israelite men have come here tonight to spy on the land. And somehow they figured out they went to her place. So the king of Jericho sent this order to Rahab. Turn over the men who came to you, the ones who came to your house, for they have come to spy on the whole land. Uh-oh. Got caught. However, this lady, again, was good at telling stories. So what does she do? She hides the men, but the woman hid the 2 men and replied to the king or the king's messengers, yes, these men were clients of mine. Probably not, but anyway, that's what she's telling the story. These men were clients of mine, but I didn't know where they came from. When it was time to shut the city gate for the night, the men left. I don't know where they were heading. Chase after them quickly, for you have time to catch them. Now, what she had done was taken them up to the roof and hidden them among the stalks of flax that she had spread on the roof. Meanwhile, the king's men tried to find them on the road to the Jordan River near the fords. The city gate was shut as soon as they set out in pursuit of them. There are people who will try to use this story to argue that sometimes it's okay to lie. And I would suggest to you that that's not the lesson we're supposed to be taking from this passage. Rahab was a pagan. She was sensitive and certainly wanted protection from Jehovah, undoubtedly completely converted later on, as we'll see. But at this time, she's still a pagan. She's kind of like Tamar, she's acting pagan-like. If she had said, oh yeah, they're right here, would God have protected them? Almost certainly. But that she wasn't at that point in her faith journey yet. She was just realizing that the only true God is the God of the Israelites. That much she had figured out, but not much more than that. So, the importance of this particular story, as we'll see later, is the fact that she recognized that there is only one God, and it is the God of the Israelites. And it's like, okay, that's who I want to be teaming up with. None of the rest of the town figured that out. Everybody else was they were either scared and trying to fight or whatever. None of the rest of them woke up and said, hey, maybe that's the only true God. Look what he's done for the Israelites. She figured that out. She understood. She had faith. That's what's critical. So anyway, to conclude this portion of the story, now before the spies went to sleep, Rahab went to the roof. She said to the men, I know the Lord is handing this land over to you. We're absolutely terrified of you, and all who live in the land are cringing before you. For we heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you left Egypt, and how you annihilated the two Amorite kings, Sihon and Og, on the other side of the Jordan. When we heard the news, we lost our courage, and no one could even breathe for fear of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. So now promise me with this oath, with an oath sworn in the Lord's name, because I have shown allegiance to you, show allegiance to my family. Give me a solemn pledge that you will spare the lives of my father, mother, brothers, sisters, and all who belong to them, and will rescue us from death. And Rahab let them down by a rope through the window or wall. House was in part of the city wall. She lived in the wall. Again, you had this entire town, only one person who looked at the evidence, what God had done for the Israelites, and then came to faith as a result. Everybody else saw the same evidence. Never occurred to them to turn to faith in Jehovah, but she did. And she and her family, just like Noah's family in the ark, she and her family were the only ones that were spared from the destruction. All right. Hidden figure number 3, Ruth. Ruth has her own book. All 4 chapters devoted to Ruth and her mother-in-law, Naomi. And I have some trepidation in talking about Ruth for the very fact that the book of Ruth is Pastor Hickson's favorite book. And I think maybe the entire Bible, certainly the Old Testament. I will try to summarize things as faithfully as I can, but certainly urge you to talk to him if you have a lot of detailed questions. What do we have here? Naomi trying to tell the daughters-in-law to turn back, and Ruth is clinging on to her, saying, no, I'm going to go with you. So briefly, beginning of the book of Ruth. During the time of the judges, there was famine in the land of Judah. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah went to live as a resident foreigner in the region of Moab, along with his wife and 2 sons. Now, the man's name was Elimelech. His wife was Naomi. The sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were of the clan of Ephrath from Bethlehem in Judah. They entered the region of Moab, settled there. Sometime later, Naomi's husband Elimelech died. So she and her 2 sons were left alone. Again, we don't, we could do an entire sermon series on the book of Ruth, and Pastor Hickson has. You can find those online. But the point is that they were in the promised land, and Elimelech didn't get it. He went to the land of Moab, should have never left the promised land in the first place. But again, what's the theme here? As we'll see, God redeems what seemed like hopeless situations. Continuing, both her sons married Moabite women. Again, what do you expect? They're living in Moab. One was named Orpah, the other Ruth. They continued to live there about 10 years. Then Naomi's 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, also died. So the woman was left all alone, bereaved of her 2 children as well as her husband. So she decided to return home from the region of Moab, accompanied by her daughters-in-law, because while she was living in Moab, she had heard that the Lord had shown concern for his people, reversing the famine and by providing abundant crops. And now as she and her 2 daughters-in-law began to leave the place where she had been living to return to the land of Judah, Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, listen to me, each of you should return to your mother's home. Jumping ahead, Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye. So there's a back and forth between them, but eventually she convinces Orpah. Orpah says, okay, fine, I'll go back to my family in Moab. But Ruth clung tightly to her. Again, there's some back and forth, and then Ruth replied, "Stop urging me to abandon you. For wherever you go, I will go. Where you live, I will live. Your people will become my people, and your God will become my God." What's the difference between Judah and Naomi? It's pretty clear Naomi must have been testifying of the wonder and goodness of God. Nothing else makes sense. She, despite the fact that, her husband undoubtedly wasn't the most righteous guy on earth, he left the promised land in the first place, should have never done that. Whatever the issues were with her sons, we don't know. Nothing's ever said about that. But it is pretty clear that Naomi loved the Lord and was telling Ruth about the stories. Now, Orpah probably heard him too. Orpah didn't get it. Orpah didn't respond. But Ruth recognized the Jehovah is God and God alone. And she refuses to leave Naomi. Plus the fact that undoubtedly through the work of the Holy Spirit on her, that she recognized Naomi needed to be cared for. And so she was, her faith was getting put into practice by caring for her mother-in-law. So what happens next? Chapter 2, Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to," they're back in Bethlehem at this point. "Let me go to the fields and pick up some leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." This was the God's instituted welfare program. The field owners would go through and they would harvest, but given the techniques and technologies they had at the time, it wasn't perfect. So there'd be some stubble and this and that left behind. And God was very clear in the law, you must leave that behind for the poor. The poor can come back in and glean and pick up enough that they won't die. So Ruth gets this and she says, "Hey, let me go out and glean." So Naomi says, "Sure, okay, go ahead." So Ruth works in the fields, and what do you know? She ends up in Boaz's field. Boaz was no ordinary Bethlehemite. Boaz notices her, he helps her, and he protects her. He says, "Oh, don't go to anybody else's field. Stay in mine. I'll tell my guys to protect you. You go to somebody else's field, you may get harmed." So he's trying to help her. What's her response? At this, she bows down with her face to the ground. She asks him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before." What was the last person who was told to leave everything? It was Abraham, right? Abraham, one of the great men of faith, and Ruth was doing the same thing. The language similarity is not a coincidence. Continuing, "May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." He's pronouncing a blessing on her. You have expressed faith in Jehovah. You're putting that faith into action, and I'm going to help you, and I'm praying that God blesses you. So what happens later? Well, it's time to do the threshing. They've cut down the stalks, and they need to separate the grain from the stalks, and there's a particular place in town where the stones are arranged in such a way to do the threshing, and it's called the threshing floor. So she goes to the threshing floor. She goes at night. Let's read it. "When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down." Now, laying at the guy's feet was basically saying, I'm putting myself in submission to you. Now, we earlier in the book, it's talked the fact that Boaz was one of the so-called kinsman redeemers of Elimelech's family. He was supposed to be able to protect them, take back control of the redeem, purchase the property, that kind of thing. He was one of the kinsman redeemers. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." Now, if you dig into it, what she was effectively doing is she was proposing to Boaz. Not the way things are normally done, of course, but that's what she was doing. And she was saying, "Look, you are a kinsman redeemer. I am asking that you marry me in order to protect, Naomi's family." So, what's Boaz's response? "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor." There's some debate about the ages, but it's entirely possible that Ruth may have been in her early 20s, and Boaz may very well have been north of 40, 50, something like that. And he said, "You're not going after the young dudes. You're not in this for yourself. You're doing this again for the sake of your family, for the sake of your mother-in-law." And he recognizes that. So what does he say? "And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character." By this point, enough time has gone by that the whole town has seen this foreigner and recognized, wow, look at the way she behaves. Look at what she does. So we're going to skip over the part where there was another kinsman redeemer who was first in line, and there's some back and forth between he and Boaz, and the guy that's first in line decides that, no, I'm not going to marry her because that could mess up my own estate. And it's like, no, I'm not going to do it. You take care of her. So Boaz, at this point, then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, because this was done publicly at the town gate, "Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are witnesses." Now, hold that thought. We're going to come back to the kids that are born a little later. But again, what's the point here? You've got a Gentile who hears about Yahweh and turns to him as the only Savior and puts her faith into practice. So hidden figure number 4 is Bathsheba. 2 Samuel chapters 11 and 12. What we see at the beginning of chapter 11, in the spring of the year, at the time when kings normally conduct wars, David sent out Joab with his officers and the entire Israelite army. That was mistake number 1. David was supposed to go to war, and he decides, nah, I'm going to take this one off. I'm going to stay home for a while. They defeated the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David stayed behind in Jerusalem. One evening, David got up from his bed, walked around on the roof of his palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. Now, this woman was very attractive. So David sent someone to inquire about the woman. The messenger says, "Isn't this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" Uriah the Hittite wasn't just some guy. as we see elsewhere in Samuel and Chronicles, Uriah the Hittite was one of David's so-called mighty men. There were 30 guys who were so incredible in the work that they did as part of David's army that they were singled out, and the Bible lists them all as David's mighty men. Uriah the Hittite was one of them. This wasn't just some dude down the street. Wouldn't have excused it anyway. But the point is that this was one of David's right-hand guys, basically. Now, this is a painting of Rembrandt, and it's depicting the point where Bathsheba has gotten the message from David to come to the palace. And in Rembrandt's interpretation, it's like, I don't want to do this, and I have to. It's the king's order. Now, you can debate about was Bathsheba completely innocent or not? Was she trying to, did everybody take baths on the roof? Was that normal? Was she taking baths when she knew that David was going to be strolling out? That kind of. The text doesn't say any of that, and there's no point in trying to. I don't see any evidence to indicate that she did anything wrong. I don't see that. So, put that aside. The focus is on David. What does David do? He sends some messengers to get her. He sleeps with her. He finds out she's pregnant, and he tries to cover it up. Again, the soap opera's got nothing on the Bible. He brings Uriah home from the battlefront under the pretext of getting information, an update about the battle. That's not why he brought him back. He gets him drunk twice in the hopes that he's going to go home and sleep with his wife and then all will be well. So this guy, Uriah the Hittite, the commentators have some mixed interpretations. Was he a Gentile that converted to Judaism, or was he a Jew that lived in Hittite region for a while and then moved back? We don't know, but it's not unreasonable, given the fact that he is referred to as Uriah the Hittite. It's not unreasonable to think that he was a Gentile that converted. Now, Uriah is a Hebrew name, so it's possible that he changed his name after he converted. Nobody knows for sure, but the point is that David gets him drunk twice, and what does he do? He does the right thing. Now, why does he do the right thing when he's drunk? Because that's what was in his heart. The influence of the alcohol didn't change his core being. So David continues with his depravity. Even while drunk, Uriah would not dishonor his fellow soldiers. They're putting their lives on the line right now. I can't come home and relax and enjoy myself. They're putting their lives on the line. I would never think to do that, in the Ark of the Covenant and everything. And even while he's drunk, he doesn't do that. So what does David do? David gets desperate. So he sends a message to the commander, Joab, to put Uriah into the worst part of the battlefield, to draw back the troops, to make sure that Uriah would be killed. That's what was in the message. Now, who carried the message? Uriah. It was sealed. Obviously, he couldn't read it. So think about this. Not only are you murdering the guy, but you're making him carry his own death warrant. Let's see. Who else had to carry their instrument of execution? Oh, yeah, it was Jesus, right? Jesus was innocent. Uriah was innocent. These are not coincidences. What happens next? The commander stations Uriah near the enemy's best soldiers. He doesn't actually pull the troops back because that would have just made it obvious to everybody what was going on, and even Joab wasn't going to do that. So he does make sure Uriah is in the worst part, and sure enough, he ends up getting killed. So the commander sends a messenger back to David, tells him the latest news, and oh, by the way, your servant Uriah is dead. David says, well, sometimes some people die. It's battles. It's okay, and then what? Bathsheba goes into mourning, of course. When the mourning period is over, David brings her home, and she bears him a son. And he's thinking everything's fine. You know what the word omniscience means? It means God knows everything. What do we see? But the thing that David had done was evil in the sight of the Lord. So, what happens next? Chapter 12. The Lord sends Nathan the prophet to David. Nathan tells David a story about a poor man and who had only one lamb. And there's a rich man with a whole herd, and the rich man takes the poor man's lamb, and David gets angry. David gets angry at this man. Says, as surely as this man, he must pay fourfold. And what does Nathan say? Well, sorry. He said to Nathan, as surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die because he committed this cold-hearted crime. He must pay for the lamb 4 times over. And Nathan's response, you are the man. Why have you shown contempt for the Lord's decrees by doing evil in my sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and you have taken his wife to be your own wife. You have killed him with the sword of the Ammonites, so now the sword will never depart from your house, for you have despised me by taking the wife of Uriah the Hittite as your own. The Lord never promises to shield us from the earthly temporal consequences of our actions. David exclaimed to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. He didn't try to hide it. He didn't try to say, oh, yeah, but. No. He repents instantly. Nathan replied to David, yes, the Lord has forgiven your sin, looking forward to Christ's sacrifice. You are not going to die, even though David just said that the man deserved to die for taking somebody's lamb. Like, yeah, you deserve to die for taking this guy's wife. You're not going to die. Nevertheless, because you have treated the Lord with such contempt in this matter, the son who has been born to you will certainly die. Nathan went to his home. The Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife had borne to David, and the child became very ill. On the 7th day, the child died. Now, we don't have time to get into it, but if you go through the rest of Samuel, what you'll find out is David effectively prophesied against himself. When he said that the man who did this should pay 4-fold, David lost 4 sons. This one was the first one. But David lost 4 sons. He effectively prophesied his own judgment in that case. Skipping ahead, David comforted his wife Bathsheba. He came to her, went to bed with her. Later she gave birth to a son, and David named him Solomon. Now the Lord loved the child. God redeems hopeless situations. So, Matthew's genealogy of Jesus records 42 generations. Why are 4 women highlighted? One of them was a prostitute. One of them pretended to be a prostitute. One of them was treated like a prostitute. And yet all of them are in the line of the Messiah. God redeems. 3 of them were Gentiles. 3 of the women were Gentiles. And the 4th one was the wife of a Gentile. The three of the Gentiles, the Rahab, Ruth, and Uriah displayed greater faith than most Israelites. That's why we read about them in the genealogy. Go back to Tamar for a moment. How did Judah change as a result of this incident? We'll go through this quite quickly. Genesis chapter 41. Joseph is in Egypt. The 7 years of abundance have come and gone, and the 7 years of famine are striking. 7 years of abundance in the land of Egypt came to an end. Then the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had predicted. There was famine in all the other lands, but throughout the land of Egypt there was food. When Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why are you looking at each other?" He said, "Look, I hear there's grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy us some grain so that we may live and not die." So they go down once, but they get discovered by Joseph, who, under disguise, questions them very closely about their father and their other brother who didn't come along on the trip, blah, blah, blah. Now, the famine was severe in the land. When they finished eating the grain they had bought from Egypt, their father said to them, "Return, buy us a little more food." But Judah said to him, "The man solemnly warned us, 'You will not see my face unless your brother is with you.'" And of course, Jacob doesn't want to send Benjamin. Like that's his favorite son. Joseph was gone. He only had 2 sons by his favorite wife. Joseph was gone. Benjamin was the only one left. And it's like, look, I'm going to die if this kid doesn't come back. No, you can't take him. Well, eventually they get so starving that he has no choice. So skipping ahead. Then Judah said to his father Israel, "Send the boy with me and we will go immediately. Then we will live and not die. We and you and our little ones. I myself pledge security for him. You may hold me liable if I do not bring him back to you and place him here before you. I will bear the blame before you all my life." What do we start to see here? Judah is concerned about somebody other than himself. So they go down there. They try to buy grain. They're heading back. Joseph is testing them. And again, what happens is like, oh, the silver cup is in Benjamin's sack. Okay, this guy's got to be my slave. The rest of you can go home, but this guy's got to be my slave. Again, Joseph was doing this to test them. He wasn't trying to torture them. He was trying to test them to see where their heart truly lay. So, jumping ahead, what does Judah say to Joseph? Again, still in disguise. Judah says, "So now, please let your servant remain as my Lord," he's talking about himself, "please let your servant remain as my Lord's slave instead of the boy. As for the boy, let him go back with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? I couldn't bear to see my father's pain." Judah wants to be the substitute penalty bearer. Where does that come back to us? So thus, what happens at the end of Genesis? Jacob's getting ready to die. Jacob calls his sons and says, "Gather together so I can tell you what will happen in future days. Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons will bow down before you. You are a lion's cub, Judah, from the prey, my son, you have gone up. He crouches and lies down like a lion, like a lioness. Who will rouse him? The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he comes to whom it belongs. The nations will obey him." This is the prophecy that says the Messiah will come through the tribe of Judah. Reuben was the firstborn. No, he slept with his father's wife. Not happening. Sons number 2 and 3, Simeon and Levi. Well, they were the ones that murdered every man in Shechem. They weren't, anything to write home about either. But Judah got the picture. He was sacrificing. He was willing to sacrifice himself on behalf of an innocent brother, and he is the one that the Messiah's line comes through. So very quickly, Rahab, what do we read about in the book of Hebrews? By faith, Rahab, the prostitute, escaped the destruction of the disobedient because she welcomed the spies in peace. Rahab is the only female and the only Gentile specifically listed in the Hall of Faith in Hebrews chapter 11. That's why she's there. Ruth. Well, I told you I'd tell you the story of the end of Ruth. Boaz married Ruth, slept with her. The Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The village women said to Naomi, "May the Lord be praised because he has not left you without a guardian today. May he become famous in Israel. He will encourage you and provide for you when you are old. For your daughter-in-law who loves you has given him birth. She is better to you than 7 sons." Naomi took the child, placed him in her lap. She became his caregiver. The neighbor women gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse, David's father. Line of the Messiah, the kings, and the Messiah comes through Ruth. And finally, with Bathsheba, jumping way ahead, 1 Chronicles 28, King David rose to his feet and said, "Listen to me, my brothers, my people. I wanted to build a temple where the ark of the Lord's covenant could be placed as a footstool for our God. I have made the preparations for building it, but God said to me, you must not build a temple to honor me, for you are a warrior and have spilled blood. From all the many sons the Lord has given me, he chose Solomon." God chose Solomon, my son, to rule on behalf over Israel. He said to me, "Solomon, your son, is the one who will build my temple and my courts, for I have chosen him to become my son, and I will become his father." So we see a little bit more now why these women were called out in those 42 generations. Some of them, were less than perfect, certainly, with Tamar's behavior and Rahab's lies, but nevertheless, God was sovereign, and he worked through these situations. The Messiah's line came through Tamar. The Messiah's line came through Rahab and Ruth and Bathsheba, despite all of the less than savory things that happened along the way. God is able to redeem. What does Paul tell us? We know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. Have you messed up so badly you think God can't use you anymore? Have you messed up so badly after becoming a Christian that you think God can't use you anymore? These stories are here to tell us that's not true. God is asking for us to be faithful, to repent when we sin, to turn back to him, and God is able to use us in his wonderful plan. Let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for these stories of these women, what you've done through them, the examples they are for us. We pray that we would be encouraged in our own faith journey, that we will continue to seek you, to serve you, and to praise you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Lord, as we go from this place, loving you more, trusting you more, may the power of your love and the light of your word shine forth to a sin-darkened world as we go from